Behind Sydney's beautiful, picturesque backdrop, there's always been a chilling, violent underbelly. Since colonial days, gangs and violent criminals who have called this city home have ruled the streets with an iron fist and remorseless disdain for human life. In this episode of Famous Graves Down Under, we take you around the cemeteries of Sydney and discover the final resting places of some of this city's most powerful and deadly underworld identities. From the shadowy figure known as the real Mr. Big, to a bank-robbing legend and master escapee. So strap yourself in as we take a walk on the wild side and discover 5 graves of the Sydney underworld. Starting at the picturesque Waverley Cemetery, one of my favourites, we begin our journey not far from the front gates, with the most powerful underworld boss Australia has ever seen, yet almost nobody has ever heard of, Mr. Frederick Paddles Anderson. Nicknamed Paddles due to his large feet, Anderson ruled the underworld from the 1950s through to the 1980s. He was known by the underworld as first among equals, while publicly, identities such as George Freeman, Stan the Man Smith and Lenny McPherson were leading figures. It was Anderson who pulled the strings from behind a thick, masking veil of secrecy. Somewhat of a godfather figure, Anderson wielded power via a string of corrupt public officials. From members of the police force and judges, his reach even went as high as political parties. Paddles was also directly responsible for setting up Australia's very own crime commission, in the style of the American mobsters of New York, Philadelphia and Chicago. While publicly, Anderson was an upstanding member of the community, he was also known to have a short temper, once reportedly hanging a jockey from the open window of a building for making the mistake of winning a race on a horse that wasn't on. He passed away on the 2nd of January 1985, and his funeral was attended by a who's who of the Sydney underworld. From here, we venture just down the hill to one of Anderson's associates, notable public racing figure, George Freeman. A well-known Sydney identity, George Freeman was also allegedly a major player in the Sydney crime scene of the 70s and 80s. He reportedly had links with American gangsters Joe Testa of the Lucchese crime family, as well as the mob's accountant, Meyer Lansky. George was one of the more public and colourful figures of the turbulent 70s and 80s Sydney scene, often lunching with police, both honest and corrupt. It's worthy to note, however, that throughout his life, George was only ever convicted of SP bookmaking in the early 60s. He passed away in 1990, aged just 55. Let's head west now and arrive at the historic Rookwood Cemetery, home to over 1 million internments. But it's 2 particular characters we've come to find. First on our hit list, excuse the pun, is the man they call the King of King's Cross and Mr. Sin, none other than Abe Saffron. Abe Saffron was a hotelier, property developer and King's Cross identity, strongly linked with organised crime in Sydney throughout his life. After serving time in the Australian Army in his younger years, it was while working at the Notorious Roosevelt Club that he began his rise to power, building a portfolio of properties throughout the Darlinghurst and King's Cross area. While he was an extremely colourful figure via his many clubs and night spots throughout Sydney, Saffron was also linked with the disappearance of retail heiress Juanita Nelson, and strongly implicated in the Luna Park ghost train fire of 1979, which killed 7 people. Abe Saffron passed away in 2006, aged 86. From here we cross this huge sprawling cemetery to the unmarked grave of career bank robber and legendary prison escapee, Darcy Dugan. This colourful crime character was a career bank robber and would spend 35 years behind bars for such crimes, half his natural life. Dugan was equally famous, however, for escaping custody no less than 6 times throughout his life, including his legendary escape from a tram that was transporting him from courthouse to prison in 1946. This daring escape became so legendary that Darcy became more infamous for his liberation than he did the crimes committed. Incidentally, the very tram Darcy Dugan escaped from can still be seen at the Sydney Tramway Museum, which I highly recommend a visit. Later in his life, Darcy became an advocate for prison reform and exposing corruption in the penal system. He passed away on the 22nd of August 1991 and was buried 7 days later in an unmarked grave on what would have been his 70th birthday. Heading west to the picturesque Pine Grove Memorial Park, we find our final character for today, the man affectionately known as Aussie Bob, Australian mafia legend Bruno Robert Trimole. Robert Trimole started life as a panel beater, pinball repairman and restaurateur, before eventually using his legitimate businesses to build a drug empire in the country town of Griffith. During his days of his drug dealing, his house would affectionately be known by locals as the Grass Castle. Trimole was later suspected of being behind the unsolved disappearance of local councilman and anti-drug campaigner Donald Mackay, whose body has never been found. In 1981, Trimole fled Australia to avoid answering for the Mackay disappearance. He fled to the United States, then to France, and finally to Ireland, where he was eventually captured, but again escaped to Spain, where he would live out his life before passing away in 1987. His funeral at Pine Grove Memorial Park was notable for the public brawl that broke out between mourners and journalists. So there we have it, folks. 5 of the most notorious underworld figures Sydney has ever seen. I hope you enjoyed this walk on the wild side of tapophilia, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing for future Famous Grave episodes, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. You can also support my channel by making a donation at buymeacoffee.com. All donations go back into the channel and are greatly appreciated. And finally, don't forget to follow me on the socials, all linked below and in my bio. Until next time, love ya.